1994. A diver slips beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe and never comes back up. 17 years later, another team of divers finds him, resting on a ledge 265 feet down, still recognizable. That single discovery is the reason scientists finally decided they needed to see the bottom of this lake for themselves. In September of 2025, they got their chance, and thousands of people watched it happen live. What the cameras showed didn't just settle decades of rumors about Tahoe. It replaced them with something quieter, and in its own way stranger. Lake Tahoe sits on the border of California and Nevada, cradled between the Sierra Nevada and the Carson Range, and it is the second deepest lake in the United States, behind only Crater Lake in Oregon. Tahoe formed close to 2 million years ago, when a section of the Earth's crust dropped between two mountain ranges rising on either side of it. The basin filled with water and never stopped, until it became a lake 22 miles long, holding enough water that if poured across the entire state of California, it would cover the state more than a foot deep. At its lowest point, near Crystal Bay, the floor sits about 1,645 feet beneath the surface. That depth is what makes Tahoe behave so differently from an ordinary lake. Once you go below roughly 700 feet, the water holds steady at around 39 degrees Fahrenheit all year long, in every season, regardless of drought or rainfall above. 39 degrees happens to be the temperature at which fresh water reaches its densest point, which is part of why that cold layer stays locked in place rather than mixing with the water above it. Down there, the pressure is heavy, the temperature never shifts, and the bacteria that normally break down anything organic move at a fraction of their usual pace. Objects that sink into that zone don't decompose the way they would near the surface. They don't bloat, they don't rise back up, and they don't fall apart. They simply come to rest at the depth where their density matches the surrounding water and they stay there. It's worth saying clearly that Tahoe does not preserve things forever, which is where a lot of popular stories about the lake get ahead of the science. The deep zones aren't empty of life. Researchers at UC Davis have estimated that Tahoe is home to something like 200 million crayfish, along with tiny mysid shrimp, and both feed on organic material that settles to the bottom. Decomposition does happen, just on a timeline that would feel unrecognizable compared to a normal lake, where something might break down in weeks. In Tahoe's cold depths, that same process can stretch out for decades. The case that proved this science beyond argument involved that missing diver. On July 10, 1994, a Reno city planner named Donald Windecker went diving near Rubicon Point on Tahoe's west shore and did not resurface. His dive partners reported him missing within hours, and search crews spent days looking, but Tahoe's depth and cold made recovery past a certain point essentially impossible. He was presumed lost to the lake permanently. Then, in July of 2011, a team of technical divers using specialized gas mixtures pushed past normal depth limits in that same stretch of water and came across a body resting on a rock ledge at 265 feet. The remains were intact enough to be visually identified as a diver still wearing his gear. A remotely operated underwater vehicle was sent down to retrieve him, and dental records confirmed what everyone suspected. It was Donald Windecker, 17 years after he vanished. The cold water and his wetsuit had done exactly what local legends always claimed the lake could do. But Windecker's case also drew a firm boundary around what those legends actually get right. His story confirmed that Tahoe's preservation properties are real and documented, but it applied to one known individual, not to the sprawling mythology of organized crime victims that has followed the lake for generations. Independent fact-checking organizations, regional newspapers, and multiple professional dive teams have gone looking for evidence of that mob graveyard story repeatedly over the decades. None of them have ever found anything to support it. The pinstripe suit legend has persisted because it's a good story, not because there's proof behind it. What is actually down there, though, turns out to be more interesting than fiction, starting with one of the largest and most photographed shipwrecks on the continent. The SS Tahoe launched in June of 1896, 169 feet long, built for a timber magnate who used her to move passengers, mail, and freight between the lake's resort towns for more than 4 decades. She earned the nickname Queen of the Lake. When she was finally retired in the late 1930s, the family that owned her decided against scrapping her. Instead, they chose to sink her intentionally, planning to settle her in about 100 feet of water near Glenbrook so that glass-bottom tour boats could show her off to visitors from the surface. The plan didn't account for the terrain. The lake floor at Glenbrook doesn't slope gently, it drops into one of the steepest underwater walls in the basin. When the ship was opened to take on water in August of 1940, she didn't settle where expected. She slid down that slope, gathering speed, and came to rest with her bow around 360 feet down and her stern near 475 feet. She sat untouched for 62 years, until a technical diving team finally reached her in 2002. What they found matched every story ever told about Tahoe's preserving cold: brass fittings that still had their shine, wood paneling that hadn't rotted, painted lettering still legible on the hull. By every account, she looked like she'd been sunk months earlier, not decades. In 2004, the SS Tahoe became the first shipwreck in Nevada listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and she remains the largest known intact wreck in the lake today. She isn't the only vessel down there. Other historic boats were deliberately sunk, burned, or lost to storms over the decades, and small wooden craft from the early 1900s still the floor of Emerald Bay, which California later designated as its first underwater state park. But every one of those wrecks was placed there on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The next discovery in Tahoe's story was placed there by nobody at all, and how it got there tells a very different kind of story about the lake. In the 1930s, during one of the most severe droughts California had seen, water levels in Lake Tahoe and the neighboring Fallen Leaf Lake dropped so far that things emerged along the shoreline that no living person had ever seen. A university researcher documented tree stumps near Taylor Creek that had been submerged for thousands of years, still rooted upright in the lakebed exactly where they had grown. Later carbon dating placed the oldest of these stumps at somewhere between 4,800 and 6,300 years old. The story grew stranger decades later at Fallen Leaf Lake, when a university professor noticed his fishing line kept snagging on something below the surface. He teamed up with researchers from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and together they documented and eventually published findings on an entire forest of pine trees still standing upright on the lake floor, some dating back over 2,000 years. These were not logs that had drifted down and settled by chance. They had grown right where they stood, along what was once dry shoreline, during a period when the lake sat hundreds of feet lower than it does now. What those trees represent is a warning written in wood. They mark a roughly 200-year megadrought during the medieval period, when the Sierra Nevada received startlingly little rain, lake levels collapsed, and forests spread into basins that are underwater today. When the rain eventually returned, the lakes refilled quickly enough that the trees drowned standing up rather than falling over. It's sobering, because it means the kind of drought capable of dropping Tahoe's level by 200 feet isn't some far-off theoretical event. It happened before, within the last 1,000 years, and the conditions that caused it haven't disappeared. Tahoe's human history holds its own difficult chapters, and one of the most significant is rarely mentioned by the millions of tourists who visit every year. Between roughly 1870 and 1890, the Tahoe Basin supplied an enormous share of the timber that fed the silver mining industry across the border in Nevada. Much of the labor behind that industry, cutting timber, maintaining the flumes that moved it, and building the surrounding infrastructure, was performed by Chinese immigrant workers. By the 1880s, the largest community of these workers in the basin was centered at Glenbrook on the East Shore, complete with communal housing and gardens that helped feed the wider workforce. Forest Service archaeologists have since identified more than 50 separate work campsites across the basin connected to this era of Chinese labor. What happened to that community afterward is a part of Sierra Nevada history that deserves to be told honestly. Anti-Chinese hostility in the region during this period was intense, and it included documented attacks on Chinese work camps, as well as coordinated economic boycotts designed to force Chinese-owned businesses and their employers out of local commerce entirely. One such campaign, organized in Truckee in the mid-1880s, became so effective and so widely copied elsewhere in the American West that it earned its own name. Within a short span, a Chinese community that had once been among the largest in the Sierra Nevada was almost completely displaced. Some of the Tahoe Basin's Chinese workers relocated to San Francisco or elsewhere in the West. Others simply disappeared from the historical record because the expulsions were rarely documented in any formal way. There is no credible evidence that any of these workers ended up in the lake itself, despite legends that occasionally claim otherwise. The real story is more straightforward and, in its own way, harder to sit with. An entire community that helped build the region's economy was pushed out through organized pressure and the threat of further harm, and most visitors today have no idea it ever happened. Tahoe's geological story isn't finished either. The West Tahoe Fault runs beneath the deepest part of the lake, and geologists have found it tends to produce a major earthquake roughly every 3,000 to 4,000 years. The most recent big rupture is estimated at about 4,500 years ago, putting the fault well within the window for another. If that earthquake strikes while it's sitting beneath all that water, the result wouldn't be an ordinary quake. Researchers who have modeled the scenario estimate an initial wave between 10 and 30 feet high, capable of reaching shoreline communities within minutes, followed by a seiche, where the enclosed basin sloshes water against the shore for hours afterward. Tens of thousands of people live along Tahoe's shoreline today, in communities with little dedicated evacuation planning for an event like this, largely because nothing like it has occurred in modern memory. The record shows it has happened before on an even larger scale. At some point in the past, a massive section of the west shore gave way in an underwater landslide roughly a mile across, and researchers estimate it may have produced a wave approaching 300 feet high. The debris from that event is still on the lake floor today. All of that history and uncertainty is part of why, in September of 2025, a non-profit partnered with an underwater engineering firm to send a remotely operated vehicle to the deepest point of the lake and stream the descent live to the public. More than 3,000 people watched in real time, and tens of thousands more viewed the footage afterward. What the vehicle found at 1,600 feet was, on the surface, almost anticlimactic. There was no creature. There were no piles of remains. There were no sunken military installations or hidden structures of any kind. The floor of the lake was covered in fine silt and sediment, drifting through the ROV's lights like slow-falling snow. A limnologist involved in the research explained afterward that the sediment is mostly made up of fine granite particles eroded from the surrounding mountains over enormous stretches of time, with only a small fraction being organic material. It settles so gradually, over decades, that it's actually part of the reason Tahoe's water stays so remarkably clear. The lake floor isn't hiding anything dramatic. It's quietly filtering itself, one grain at a time. The dive did turn up something far less mysterious but genuinely worth noting: discarded tires and fishing gear scattered across the lakebed, evidence of just how much human litter accumulates in one of the most visited alpine lakes in the country. The same organization has pulled dozens of tires from the lake in earlier expeditions. In a single live stream, this expedition put to rest years of speculation about what lies at Tahoe's bottom, while also making clear that the lake's real unresolved mysteries are found above the waterline, in the stories of people who went into Tahoe's world and never came back to explain what happened. One of those stories belongs to Donna Lass, a 25-year-old nurse working at a casino on the Nevada side of the lake in 1970. She finished her shift, clocked out, and was never seen again. 4 decades her case sat unresolved, occasionally linked by speculation to an unidentified serial offender active in Northern California at the time, though that connection was never confirmed. It wasn't until modern DNA technology advanced enough, more than 50 years later, that investigators were finally able to identify remains discovered years earlier in the nearby mountains as Donna's. Her case remains formally open today, and whoever was responsible has never been identified. What her story illustrates is the real shape of Tahoe's mysteries, not staged legends about bodies stacked on a lake floor, but genuine unanswered questions involving real people who disappeared into a landscape too vast to search completely, and who waited decades for the science to catch up with their case. The lake still claims lives every year through drowning, largely due to the same cold water shock that preserved Donald Windecker's remains for so long, and long before modern science had a name for that phenomenon, the Washoe people already understood it. The Washoe have lived in the Tahoe Basin for at least 6,000 years, and in their tradition this lake was the center of their world, both sacred and dangerous at once. Their stories describe powerful beings associated with the deepest water, believed capable of pulling swimmers under without warning and causing sudden storms and disappearances. Certain locations, like Cave Rock on the east shore, were treated with particular caution and approached only by healers bearing offerings, understood as a threshold between the everyday world and the world beneath the surface. For much of the 20th century, outsiders dismissed these traditions as folklore with no practical basis. What modern science has gradually come to recognize is that the Washoe were describing, in the language available to them, an accurate body of observational knowledge built over thousands of years. The cold water shock that kills swimmers today is the same force their oral tradition described as the lake pulling people under. A sudden drop into 39-degree water triggers an involuntary gasp reflex and can overwhelm even strong swimmers within seconds. The specific locations the Washoe warned about often correspond to real zones of unpredictable currents or sudden depth and temperature changes, the exact conditions that make drowning more likely. They couldn't describe the underlying physics, but they described the outcome with total accuracy, refined generation after generation by people who paid close attention to a lake that could take a life without warning. What the ROV footage confirmed in 2025 wasn't a monster or a graveyard. It confirmed that Lake Tahoe's real story was never about what's hiding at the bottom. It's about the physics of cold, clear water, a handful of documented human tragedies, a drowned forest that hints at a drought waiting to happen again, a fault line that hasn't finished its business, and a community of people who read this lake's dangers correctly thousands of years before anyone brought a camera down to check.